overtime here again at Old Favorite Friday, and we are continuing the conversation about Fuller's London Pride, a beautiful British beer. I'm joined by my beautiful British friend, Phil Clarke from the Britain Yankee podcast. Phil, this beer is so British that it tried to colonize my fridge. So I think you're the perfect person to talk about it. Was it required for you to pick a beer from your home country, or was this a beer just you love that much?
No, when you asked me if you'd like to do one of these, I said, of course, because I've watched many of your other ones, Kevin, and they're all great. All the beers remind me of ones that I used to drink outside of the current craft beer now. But, when I went back and said, what is it that I haven't had for a while? Well, I found this as I was in my local liquor store, Fuller's London Pride. I used to drink this quite a bit. This, to me, is the precursor to Killian's Irish Red. Now, it's not the same type of beer, but when I came over here, that's what I found to be able to drink. I couldn't get this. Now I can get it here. This is a good beer.
Yeah, it's really nice. It's funny. I was doing some research on this. Beer's been around for a long time, but I was doing some research on this, and every website lists this beer as a different style. I've seen it listed as an ESB. I've seen it listed as a pale ale. I've seen it as an amber ale. I've just seen it as an ale. So if you go to the website and if you read the bottle, which is probably the best thing to do, it just says amber ale. Does this remind you of ESBs and just simple pale ales, or is it just the fact that things get lost in translation?
Well, you're right. This is kind of a little bit of a crossover beer. Now, this has been brewed since I think it's the 1950s, 1959, something like that. And it was a beer that came out when there was a lot of other beers like this. I remember one called Watney's Red Barrel, but this one was probably the premier beer out of Fuller's, who was independently owned at that time. I would call it in between an amber and a pale. But when we get it in a bottle here, it's considerably different to how you might get it if you had it on draft, or even better, out of a keg.
So that's a really good point. And, we're talking a lot of times, Barrel Monk specializes originally in Belgian beer, so we have a lot of understanding of those great European beer styles. We don't talk a lot about the difference between bottled beers and draft beers. We have talked about bottle conditioning, but it doesn't come up all the time in here. So give me a little info here. The beer is a little bit different in bottles over here. Can you explain that a little bit?
I'm sorry, I lost you there. Oh, there you are. You're back again. Sorry. What was the last question?
I said
just briefly.
No. I said that we don't get a chance to talk a lot about the differences between draft and bottles. But you just mentioned the fact that the bottles we get over here are a little bit different than the draft you might get or a cask beer. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Well, I think basically what you've got here is a beer that's been imported. And as you probably well know, because you bottle a lot of beers, you can beers, I think there's a use of CO2 to put into the bottle to keep it fresh, keep that oxygen out so it doesn't become oxidized. When you've got a draft system, I think I'm correct in saying that the CO2 goes into it directly, so you're going to get kind of a freshness to it. Obviously, it's been in the fermenter for a while. I don't know how they ship this over here. I know it gets imported, I think, into Connecticut somehow. But if you have it fresh draft, and you said about keg as well, keg is when it's kind of naturally conditioned in let's say a wooden keg. But I know these days most people are using the stainless steel small firkins. But then it's the natural carbonation. Now in the bottle, I've got a little bit of head on there now. You can swirl it around there and you can get a little bit more up. And you will get more head on a bottled beer, I think. Does that change the flavor? It shouldn't do, but I think you may get that carbonation change.
Well, the cask ale is definitely going to have like a creamier mouthfeel, not nearly as effervescent in the carbonation, which is really interesting, especially if you're getting that direct pull that not very many bars are doing. Mostly British pubs really are still doing that on a regular basis. I love the bitterness of this beer. I love the fact that you've got the malt sweetness and then you've got the baseline bitterness. It's nothing compared to like the West Coast IPAs of the like mid 2000s compared to bitterness. But now the pendulum swung so far back to every IPA being juicy and fruity that a little bit of bitterness seems a little bit shocking. You mentioned the bitterness a little bit when we were talking about this before the recording. How do you feel about that bitterness in this beer?
Well, the bitterness in this, I don't think you would call it bitter if you're over here in the States, which I am, and you are as well. It's a different type of bitterness. Bitterness, when you ask for a pint of bitter in an English pub, you're not going to get anything that's really bitter. There is going to be a certain amount to it. This has got more than I know from my favorite pint, which is from Harvey's Brewery, and that's a pint of Sussex bitter. But this one, you know, I say it's bitter, but it really has kind of a smoothness to the end of it. It's a beautiful pint.
Yeah,
I think the hops in it are Challenger, and then there's one other, and it might be East Kent Goldings.
Yeah, so I was looking up and I don't remember the exact hops, but they did like to promote the fact that all the ingredients were British ingredients. So they were British hops, British malts, which makes a lot of sense. It's one of the great things about being in that region is there's so much great accessibility to hops and malts that are been grown for centuries over there. Listen, the smoothness of this beer is really, really impressive because the bitterness kind of adds on to the very end of it after having that nice sweet malt flavor. Balance it really, really well. And you said that it kind of makes you want to go back for another sip, which is a really great thing that we kind of underrated in general, is that, you know, that malt sweetness needs to be balanced out by the bitterness. Phil, you do a podcast, the Britain Yankee Pubcast. Do you want to just kind of touch on that really briefly?
Yeah, real briefly, it covers mostly local area breweries in the Chicagoland and suburbs, of which there are, I think, coming up for now nearly 300 of them. I'm also doing YouTube challenges and videos where I'm getting brewers to do a blind taste test, take their beer and compare it to a classic example from BJCP guidelines. That's the Beer Judge Certification Program. So that's another series we've been putting out. And Kevin, I just want to say, I think I'm going to get you to do it as well.
You're going to challenge me. We are going to actually do that kind of in conjunction a little bit with my good buddy, Mike Urevich, for the United podcast, which is my beer podcast as well. We're always trying to cross promote over here. So, and you said you cover mostly beers out of the Chicagoland area, but I've been on the show multiple times.
You have.
And I've had a chance to visit, and you were a great host over there. So highly recommend you check out Phil's podcast. I also really want to appreciate everybody that's joining us and watching this video. We have had some technical difficulty. There's been a little bit of buffering and things of that nature, but I hope you stuck with us and you like hearing about these incredible beers. Do you have anything else you want to add about Fuller's, about any kind of other craft beers, you know, those classic style British ales?
I will just say that the name London Pride actually comes from a flower, and it has a Latin name I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, but that it started to grow in the 1950s on the blitzed bomb sites in London. And it was the common name is London Pride. So that's how they picked it up. It was kind of like an homage to the people who got through that World War. And they brewed the beer since 1959. I think Fuller's is now owned by Asahi. So maybe they've changed the recipe a little bit. But I'll tell you what, I know you can get this down there in Florida, where you are, and you can get it up here in the Chicago area. So I'm sure it's distributed across the country. If you can find it, go out and try it. Oh, one other thing. Don't drink it completely cold from the fridge. Let it warm up for 5 minutes or so, because it's going to release a lot more flavor.
That's a great point, Phil. We try to talk about that a lot, as far as that not the only beers that are meant to be drank freezing cold are usually pretty boring beers, because we really want to have the aroma and the flavor that comes off of them. And listen, every one of these videos are done because we want to promote these beers. We want to get people to go out there, engage in the conversation, try a beer maybe they haven't had in a while, or a beer they never had before. And you can't go wrong with a classic beer like this. It ticks every box. It's drinkable. It's flavorful. It's also accessible for a lot of people. You don't have to be a big hop head to like this. You don't have to be a craft beer aficionado. It's a classic for a reason. So please, Fuller's London Pride, go pick one up. And, we'll be back here again next week. We'll be having some other guests, and we'll be talking about great beer as always. Phil, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, let's do a long distance cheers. How can we do that? There we go. Cheers.
Cheers. Have a good one.
Take care. Thanks, Kevin. All the best.